I hadn't returned to my village in over a decade. Life in the city had buried those memories beneath concrete schedules and endless noise. But when my father passed, something inside me stirred, an urge to revisit the house where my childhood echoed in every wall. The journey back was quiet. As the bus rumbled through dusty roads and rustling fields, I felt a strange knot of dread and longing. When I arrived, the house stood just as I remembered, old, proud, and silent. Ivy had climbed the outer walls, the gates creaked in protest, and the air carried the weight of something unfinished. Inside, it was colder than I had imagined. Every room whispered of absences. The furniture remained covered in white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be remembered. I had planned to stay a few nights, but the solitude gnawed at me faster than expected. The nights were long, with the occasional owl hooting or a window rattling in the wind. I began dreading nightfall. By the third evening, I knew I couldn't sleep alone again. That's when I recalled something the shopkeeper in the village had mentioned, a local shepherd who often stayed with people for companionship during harvest season. He was quiet, trustworthy, and had nowhere particular to be. On a whim, I asked around and eventually found him near the southern grazing hill, herding a small group of sheep under the orange sun. He was younger than I expected, perhaps in his late 20s. His name was Imran. His eyes were the kind that rarely blinked, watchful, reflective. He didn't say much when I introduced myself, only nodded and listened. When I asked if he would consider staying at my house for a few nights, he paused, then simply said, "If it makes you feel safer, yes." That night, he arrived with only a small bundle, probably a blanket and some bread. We shared a simple dinner, mostly in silence, occasionally breaking it with awkward conversation. He asked little, yet seemed to observe everything. There was something calming about his presence, like a fire that didn't crackle too loudly. Later, I offered him the room opposite mine. He thanked me with a polite nod and disappeared behind the door. Sometime in the middle of the night, I stirred from sleep. There was a noise, barely audible. The old house creaked often, but this felt different. I opened my eyes and realized someone was near. Through the dim moonlight, I saw Imran standing by my bed. I froze. Then, with a slow, almost reverent motion, he lifted one of my legs and let it rest gently on the mattress's edge. He didn't say a word. And then, just as silently, he left the room and closed the door behind him. I lay there, wide, awake, my heart pounding, not from fear, but from something far more unsettling. What had just happened? And why did part of me not want to ask? The next morning, I found Imran sitting quietly in the courtyard, slicing a guava with a small folding knife. Sunlight touched his shoulders like a blessing, and for a moment, he looked more like a painting than a man. He glanced up as I approached, but said nothing about the night before. I wanted to ask why he was in my room, what he was thinking, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I offered him tea. He accepted with a small smile as though nothing had happened. Throughout the day, we worked together in silence. He helped clear fallen leaves from the veranda, mended a broken chair, and even patched a leak in the weedy kitchen roof. His hands were rough, skilled, and moved with quiet purpose. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, not in a way that made me uneasy, but as though he were trying to understand something I wasn't yet aware of myself. Evening fell. We sat on the steps, watching the village lights flicker on one by one. Crickets sang in the background. I found myself talking more than usual, telling him about my childhood, my father's stern silence, and the way this house used to feel alive when my mother played her old harmonium. Imran listened without interruption. When I paused, he said, "Sometimes it's not the walls we miss. It's the voices that used to echo inside them." His words struck something tender in me. That night, he cooked lentils over the clay stove and added a strange herb I'd never tasted before. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. As we ate, he finally asked, "Do you believe some houses carry emotions?" I looked up. "I think they remember things." Or maybe we project our feelings onto them. He nodded slowly, and our eyes met for a second too long. I broke the gaze, unsure of what stirred inside me. Before heading to his room, Imran paused at the hallway. "About last night," he said softly. "I'm sorry if I startled you." I hesitated. "Why did you do it?" He exhaled, gaze fixed on the wooden floor. "I thought you were cold. I shouldn't have acted without asking. It won't happen. Again." And just like that, he disappeared into the shadows. But sleep didn't come easy. His presence lingered like a scent I couldn't name. That single act, so simple, so strange, felt heavier with meaning now. I kept replaying it, wondering whether it was a gesture of care or something else entirely. The house, once silent and still, now pulsed with something new. Not fear, not comfort, something in between. A curiosity that kept me awake long after midnight. Something about Imran didn't fit the mold of a quiet shepherd. And I was starting to wonder, was I drawn to him or merely to the mystery he carried? The following days unfolded with a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Imran had quietly embedded himself into the daily routine, rising early, feeding the cows in the neighboring shed, sweeping the porch before the wind could scatter dust across it again. I watched him from the kitchen window sometimes, wondering how someone so quiet could unsettle me so deeply. The more time we spent together, the more I noticed how our conversations had shifted. They weren't just about the house or chores anymore. They were about longing, memory, and the quiet ache of solitude. I found myself laughing more, softer, but fuller. It was a strange kind of closeness, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, as we sat in the courtyard beneath a sky stitched with stars, Imran broke the silence. "You never told me why you really came back," he said, eyes fixed on the night. "I needed closure," I answered after a long pause. "My father left me this house, but he never gave me peace. I thought maybe the walls held answers he never spoke." Imran looked at me, his gaze unwavering. Sometimes we come looking for answers and find something else entirely. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. Later that night, the power flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the moonlight pouring through the open windows. I lit a candle and made my way to the living room, where Imran sat by the fireplace, unmoving, lost in thought. He looked up as I approached, the candlelight catching the sharp angle of his jaw, softening the harshness of his otherwise rugged face. "You're not just a shepherd, are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips curved slightly. "Does it matter?" Silence hung between us. I sat beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel his warmth. He reached for the candle and without blowing it out, set it aside. The room glowed between us, as if the house itself was listening. I was engaged. "Once," he said suddenly. "She left without warning. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. I kept searching for what I did wrong until I realized some people don't leave because of you. They leave because of themselves." There was a crack in his voice that he quickly covered with a breath. I didn't speak. I just placed my hand over his instinctively. He flinched, just slightly, but didn't pull away. Then he said, almost to himself, "Do you ever wonder if pain makes us more capable of love, or just more afraid of it?" I didn't know the answer, but I knew what I felt in that moment. His vulnerability wasn't a pause or weakness. It was a door he was letting me open, and part of me was already stepping through. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that every step toward him was also a step toward betrayal. The final morning arrived with an eerie stillness. Birds still chirped and the breeze still rustled through the neem trees, but something in the air felt different, like the moment just before a downpour. I woke alone, Imran's blanket lay folded neatly on the chair outside his room. His bundle was gone. Panic wasn't my first reaction. Confusion was. Why leave without a word after everything we'd shared? After the quiet intimacy, the confessions, the silences we'd filled with unspoken understanding? I searched the entire property, even ran to the edge of the nearby fields. No trace. It was as if he'd been a figment of my grieving mind, except I could still feel his presence in the creases of the pillow, in the leftover warmth of the blanket, in the dent his footsteps had left on the path behind the house. Hours later, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A note, tucked beneath the clay cup we used for evening tea. It was written in uneven script, as though he hadn't written anything in years. Forgive me for not saying goodbye. I didn't plan to stay long. I only stayed because you reminded me of the person I used to be before life taught me to. Disappear quietly. You were kind. Too kind. And I knew if I stayed longer, I would start needing something you were never meant to give. What I did that first night, it was foolish, instinctive. I saw you shivering and didn't think, but I realize now it wasn't just about comfort. It was the beginning of me forgetting my boundaries. I started to care, deeply, dangerously, and that's not fair to you. I read the note 3 times, before folding it and placing it back where I found it. 1,000 thoughts crowded my mind, but none brought clarity. He had left just as quietly as he'd entered my life, like a shadow cast only for a moment before being swallowed by night. Later that week, while walking through the market, I overheard 2 villagers discussing a theft from the temple's charity fund. A man had taken shelter in the priest's home weeks ago, offering help and silence, and then vanished. When they mentioned his name, I didn't blink. Imran. I said nothing. I simply turned and walked away. Betrayal doesn't always come with violence or raised voices. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in warmth, smiles, and shared silences. It doesn't tear through. It melts in, unnoticed, until one day you find yourself holding an empty space where trust used to be. I returned to the house that night alone. No footsteps echoed behind mine. No tea simmered on the stove. No voice in the courtyard. Just memory. And the quiet realization that love, no matter how fleeting, always leaves something behind, even when it was never meant to stay.